Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is Giran Ozcan. He's the U.S. representative for Turkey's People's Democratic Party. With us from Istanbul is journalist and talk show host Ahu Ozyurt. Aykan Erdemir is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a former member of the Turkish parliament. And Metin Gurcan is a columnist and security analyst. He served as a Turkish military advisor in such places as Afghanistan and Iraq. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Metin, let me start with you. Let's look at this election in Istanbul for mayor. It's a re-vote. It appears to have exposed very big divisions in Turkish politics. President Erdogan says that this re-vote will strengthen democracy, but the opposition says it's an outrageous move designed to eliminate dissent. Which is it?
Yeah. It is indeed a critical juncture. First, let me start with this important point. For almost a decade, until the night of the 31st of March, marking the end of local elections in Turkey, we had been thinking that AKP, the ruling party, Mr. Erdogan's AKP, was invincible, and the opposition was hopeless and incapable of winning elections. But the results, the outcome of these local elections of 31st of March, the recent local elections, changed this perception. So right now, I think opposition got the upper hand and fully aware of that. And after getting these victories results, particularly in western coastal urban settlements in Turkey, I think opposition right now energized, its agency, and then right now trying to directly get this challenge of rerun elections that is going to happen this Sunday. So the opposition's candidate, Mr. İmamoğlu, right now he really knows how to play this victimization issue. This first outcome of the elections was cancelled by the higher, judicial board, election board. And right now he is really good at playing with this victimization card. And then he's running well until so far.
Aykan, do you agree that the opposition is energized right now, that they have the wind at their back, that they can win this re-vote?
Certainly, the opposition is energized, and the latest polls show that the opposition candidate İmamoğlu has picked up some additional 9% of support. And furthermore, when we take a look at the number of Turkish citizens volunteering for ballot box observation, there have been tens of thousands of new recruits. So it seems Erdogan's gamble has backfired. He was hoping to win Istanbul back. Historically, he has given huge importance to Istanbul. He is on the record saying, if we lose Istanbul, we lose Turkey. But it seems now he will be losing Istanbul for the second time in a row. And of course, the repercussions will be great, not only for Istanbul or Turkey, but also for Erdogan's own ruling party, the Justice and Development Party.
Right. Are there concerns in Turkey over whether the president will accept the outcome of the vote if he loses? Because he has threatened to prevent the opposition candidate from taking office if he wins, because the opposition candidate has been charged with insulting a provincial governor. That case is still pending.
When it comes to not recognizing election results, Erdogan has been very frank and on the record. In fact, even recently, he said there could be various legal and administrative ways to prevent İmamoğlu from taking office. Right. And previously, he has removed over 100 elected mayors during the previous election and this election. Especially pro-Kurdish mayors from office, and appointed hand-picked trustees to replace them. So Erdogan's track record shows that there is always a risk that you might emerge victorious from the ballot box, but you might not get to serve.
All right, let's go to Ahu Ozyurt. She's also in Istanbul. And Ahu, what are Turks making of this re-vote? I mean, is it being seen as some kind of a referendum on the president?
I think it turned out to be, just as Aykan mentioned, it turned out to be the vote for unfairness versus real choice. I think most people, the real critical issue at the Sunday's vote is, are the heartbroken AK Party voters, AKP voters, going to go to the polls and make the switch, vote for Binali Yildirim, who is the candidate of Mr. Erdogan, or they will refrain from participating in this election, showing some sort of a protest vote, and switch the balance to Ekrem İmamoğlu's side. That's only about 2 or 3% of the vote, electoral vote. Both sides have basically consolidated their base. What is uncertain is the undecided and the heartbroken AK Party and the nationalist vote that may switch over to one side, tip the balance to the other, or refrain from going to the ballot box, and may make a difference at the end of the day in terms of the vote count. People are, as far as we know, people are still unhappy about the whole judicial drama that unfolded and turned out to be taking the mandate from İmamoğlu. That's one factor. But the second biggest factor is probably the economy. And Istanbul, as the biggest city of Turkey, has been suffering deeply with the recent recession that Turkey is going through. Unemployment rates are incredibly high. The prices have not really come down. It's a good summer for tourism, but it's not showing up in the wallets of the ordinary citizens. So it's basically the economy and the judicial process that's been going on. I think that's going to make or break it for İmamoğlu.
Giran, President Erdogan, actually, he himself launched his political career in Istanbul. He served there as mayor. Are we making too much of this as a local election, or is it emblematic of something much bigger in the country?
Well, I don't know. I think before we made too much of it, Erdogan himself made quite a lot of the Istanbul elections. And I think the large-scale victories that the opposition scored throughout the major cities, and this included the capital city, Ankara, cities like Mersin and Adana to the south, all the large-scale victory there and the actual unification of the opposition has meant that this has been a much more significant election than what it would have been if it had just been run on local issues throughout the country. For the first time, the opposition unified against the repressive and authoritarian turn that Erdogan's taken in the last few years, which probably in itself helped a lot to unify the opposition. And therefore, the huge successes throughout the whole country, and now finally in Istanbul, has ensured that this is definitely much more significant, and it means much more than just who gets to clean the streets in each of these cities, and has a much more national meaning for everyone. And I think especially Erdogan's reaction to Istanbul has turned this into much more than what it would have been if he had just let it go in the first place.
To Ahu's point, Gurcan, and that is there are a lot of voters in Istanbul who are unhappy with the decision made by the Election Commission. They're also unhappy with the economy, as she pointed out. But will that possibly get more people out to vote? There were something like 1.7 million people who didn't vote at the end of March. Could we see them come out?
So I think it is going to be about mobilization. And if, as Ahu said, the AKP's base, if they go out less, that will obviously have a significant impact. But I think the people that didn't go on the other side, they're going to have a much more significant impact. For example, the Kurdish vote in Istanbul is quite significant. And we know that they weren't completely mobilizing on the 31st of March, although they were very significant in İmamoğlu's victory. We know that there's still more of them that can go out. And since the 31st of March, the language and rhetoric hasn't changed on both the AKP side, and the positive language deployed by İmamoğlu hasn't changed too. And I think that that's going to have an impact in getting more of the Kurdish vote out on the 23rd of June as well, which in itself will be very significant.
Metin, let's look at how this revote is being seen outside Turkey, especially in Europe. Let's see what the view from Brussels is like. The European Union has been very critical of the revote. It warned, to use their words, it warned that the rule of law and fundamental rights are threatened. Will this controversy impact Turkey's status with the European Union?
Yes, I mean, it's a very, very important question, and this rerun election will be carefully monitored by not only by Brussels, but also by those, capitals in Europe. And then I also observed that there will be many, Europeans officially or unofficially coming to Istanbul and directly monitoring the election process and then the process, voting and then counting process. So it's an important point. And then I also have to re-emphasize the significance of Istanbul. We are not talking about a simple city here, talking about the city with the population of 16 million people. And I can already emphasize the symbolic significance of Istanbul, but also economic side of the story is very important. Istanbul is a city with the annual budget of around $8 billion US, making this city as the second economic entity, the second biggest one in Turkey after the state-owned Tüpraş. And also another important point, maybe I should say, since 1950s, Turkey has elections. So a multi-party system started in 1950s. There are three important factors directly shaping the voting preferences of people. The very first one is economic indicators. Ahu already emphasized the crippling economy and an economic crisis in Turkey, which will directly affect people's voting preferences. And the second one is personal charisma. And this is a very important point. I think for almost a decade, this is the first time a candidate has been able to present itself as the rival of Mr. Erdogan and directly trying to tarnish his personal charisma. I'm talking about Mr. İmamoğlu. So will this election, I think this election also will be an important challenge, a sort of duel between these two leaders, the charisma of Mr. Erdogan and the charisma of Mr. İmamoğlu. And then the third factor is the last week is extremely important. I mean, the week just before the elections, and right now we see, despite the fact, despite AK Parti's efforts to tarnish Mr. İmamoğlu's charisma, I would suggest that he is still very seen, very intact, and then very powerful, and then he feels himself ready to, put his agency during the elections. So he seems very strong.
Okay, Aykan, what is your view on Turkey's relationship with the European Union? Turkey has expressed a wish to become a member of the European Union. In fact, that process has already started. But would this be seen as a little bit of a setback to those efforts?
Now, EU-Turkey relations have been going through one of the worst moments in its long history. Turkey has been an associate member for over 50 years, has been an accession country. But recently, the European Parliament had an overwhelming vote calling the European Commission to end Turkey's accession talks. So it seems as if these decades-long struggles on the part of Turkey to be a member of the EU might be coming to an end. And in fact, the annulment of the vote on March 31st was one of the final nails in that coffin, because Turkey's turn away from ballot box democracy could have been lethal in this process, because Turkey has already suffered, as mentioned in various European Union reports, from erosion of separation of powers, checks and balances, rule of law, and due process. But at least the ballot box was intact, meaning people could still go to the polls and change their elected officials. But Erdogan almost changed that equation by annulling Istanbul's vote. And I think that also drew a lot of criticism from the EU. Now, on Sunday, if the opposition wins again, and if Erdogan finds yet another pretext to not hand power over to the opposition, I think it could be a lethal blow to Turkey's relations with the European Union and its European Union accession process, and also the ongoing attempts to revise the customs union with the EU.
Yeah. Ahu, do you agree that if President Erdogan doesn't recognize the outcome of the election, that is if he loses, if the opposition candidate wins, it could be a fatal blow to those efforts to get into the EU?
I fully agree, and it's probably much worse than this. That's why I think İmamoğlu needs a clearer margin than the previous election. It won't cut the deal if it's just 10,000 votes or 20,000 votes this time. He needs a clearer, a wider margin to prove that he has the mandate. And it's just not just for the EU accession talks, but it's for the sake of democracy. It's for, as Aykan mentioned, the separation of powers. And it's for the entire society to feel normalized again, that it is democracy and it's the ballot box that counts. That's why the challenge and the burden is on the side of the opposition to make it clearer and bigger margin, to win by a bigger margin this time if they can. I think the AK Party is gearing up for something smaller than that. They think the race can come up at the end of the day by a margin like 20,000 votes, 30,000 votes. I think Mr. Erdogan will not be satisfied with such a margin. So when it comes to the final stretch, the opposition really has to make the final push to get a bigger margin, to prove that at least the ballot box, the democracy, the people's democracy is sound and safe.
Giran, is there a bigger question here on which direction Turkey is heading in? There was a commentary piece, an opinion piece published in Israel by the very influential Israeli commentator Amos Esrael, in which he said that Turkey's pivot to the West, which began shortly after the War of Independence, is all but over.
Well, it does seem that we've hit the height of that pivot already, because right now we're talking about things, especially here in this city, in DC, that maybe only 3 or 4 years ago were unimaginable. We're talking about an S-400 purchase from Russia that has people scrambling in this city. We have letters flying around from defense departments from here, and then we have a response from the defense ministry in Turkey that in terms of language, are pretty scary in the sense that we are now in uncharted waters. This is, by a lot of accounts, a slow-motion car crash waiting to happen, and everyone's now maybe preparing for how to go through an amicable divorce. And so I do think that, yes, we are seeing Turkey question its position in the world. Whether this comes from some sort of confidence that's well placed, I'm not too sure. But right now, the institutions in Turkey, there are influential people amongst the institutions of Turkey that don't see a relationship with the US as well within the interests of the Turkish nation. And I think that's being played out right now.
Metin, that's a key issue that Giran just raised there, and that is the purchase by Turkey of a defense system from Russia. Turkey, of course, is a key member of NATO. It has allies in Western Europe. It's a close ally of the United States as well. What kind of message does that send?
Yeah, I mean, foreign policy-related issues, and particularly this S-400 versus F-35 conundrum. And then this is a big issue. In July, that will be having some clues for us for the future course of the events. So July will be very hot month in this sense, because Russia, Moscow has repeatedly emphasized that the delivery of those S-400 systems to Turkey will be carried out in July. And then Mr. Erdogan himself repeatedly emphasized that this is a done deal. But at the same time, we see some sort of direct, I would say, threats from DC saying that if you do this, if you purchase S-400 system, then you will be, facing with the consequences, both is in the field of security and in economic and in diplomatic terms. So this will be a big issue in this portfolio of foreign policy. But also we have some other issues as well. The future of Syria, the things that are happening in the north of Syria, particularly the Idlib issue, and also the things that are happening in Eastern Mediterranean, the rivalry over hydrocarbon reserves, and then also the crisis between Turkey and Greek Cypriots and then Greece. And also some problems in Black Sea region. So in terms of foreign policy, Turkey has had a very, very tight schedule and also very, very thick files And also in the midst of this, we also have to remember the fact that we have a sort of the ruling elites right now, particularly Mr. Erdogan, has a populist discourse. So everything is for domestic political consumption. So right now, the foreign policy tectonic plate is literally intermingled with the domestic politics in Turkey, making foreign policy choices much more how can I say, hard to follow. And then foreign policy has literally become a domestic political issue at the moment, which makes those decisions harder to manage and the crisis harder to manage.
Right. Aykan, of course, these differences between Turkey and the United States are now out in the open. The United States has expressed its unhappiness with this purchase from Russia and is threatening the sale of stealth aircraft to Turkey. Turkey, in turn, has said that if the United States imposes any kind of sanctions on it, it will retaliate.
Now, of course, the blocking of the F-35 jets to Turkey is not the only pushback that's coming from U.S. Turkey's purchase of S-400s will also trigger CAATSA sanctions, which can block further cooperation between U.S. and Turkish defense industries. Of course, there will be designation of a number of Turkish individuals and entities, which will be basically prevented from doing business with the U.S. So the repercussions, the fallout from this crisis will be much wider than we imagine at this point. There will be economic consequences because just in the supply chain of the F-35 stealth jets, Turkish businesses have almost $12 billion worth of business opportunities which will be lost. But when you add other cooperation in other fields of the defense sector, the tally will go up. And when we juxtapose this crisis with the Turkish economy's ongoing crisis, it will have a compounding effect because Turkey is already suffering from this economic downturn. It's going to be a difficult 2019. Right. Turkish corporations have huge foreign currency loans that they are struggling to pay. And if US sanctions trigger yet another payments crisis and lead to yet another devaluation in the Turkish lira, I think Erdogan will have a lot of explanation to do to the Turkish public.
Ahu, could it get to that point where we see the United States target Turkish individuals, target Turkish companies? We're talking about two very close allies here. And Turkey, of course, we can't forget, is a close ally in a very important part of the world.
We do, but I think there is a Bloomberg story about 3 sanction packages that President Trump and his administration is working on these days. I think Ankara is being a little bit optimistic about Trump using his waiver in terms of the CAATSA sanctions. When United States really decides to change the direction of the ship, it might be too late for Ankara to convince Trump, even if 2 presidents get together in the G20 summit in Japan. I think Ankara is still not really serious about the consequences, but it believes, I think Erdogan believes he can play the Incirlik card, other issues that there is general sentiment in Ankara that U.S. cannot sacrifice Turkey. They may be overplaying their hand at this point, but it looks like they're still negotiating, and I think that's because of the deep-rooted defense relations from both sides.
Okay, and we have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but before we go, a reminder to check out our podcast. It's available through Apple, Google, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering similar stories from around the world that we do right here on the program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So check it out and subscribe. Search online for CGTN and The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.